Hello, hi everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to present our work. My name is Sanja Hajdinjak and I will be presenting a paper, Who's Brexit?, focusing on how Irish, British and the EU executives framed the Brexit crisis in their public speeches.
Thanks, Sanja, and also hi from my side. My name is Olga and I'm going to be presenting the first part of the paper. So just a few words on background and relevance. I think it's not hard to establish the relevance of Brexit research because it's undoubtedly one of the most salient issues on Europe's political agenda today. One of the most fundamental characteristics of Brexit is that it's a situation of great uncertainty because it's an unparalleled event and we don't know what consequences it will have because there's no example in the past. There's another difficulty, and that is that the negotiating partners in this process, in this Brexit negotiations, that they have very diverging interests, and that's therefore difficult to find a common denominator. And just delving a little more into these differences, or actually in the fact that we look at a negotiation process, we have the European Union and the UK as main negotiating parties. And while EU member states are all affected by Brexit, we have one country that sticks out in being most affected by the negative externalities of Brexit, and that's Ireland, basically just due to the fact that there will be an EU external border on the Irish island after Brexit. We basically perceive Brexit negotiations as a framing contest, and in that sense, executives involved in this negotiation process have the responsibility to discuss issues relevant from their perspective and to frame Brexit in a way that serves their interest and the interest of those they represent. And that already brings us to theory. So we draw on framing theory, basically looking into frames of Brexit, while Brexit or frames are defined according to the pertinent definition by Robert Entman of 1993. And he says that to frame something is to select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in a communicating text. In such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, a causal interpretation, a moral evaluation, and or a treatment recommendation for the item described. And drawing on that theoretical framework, we want to map and understand the strategies of influential decision makers that are involved in this negotiation process. And in that sense, we perceive Brexit as a critical juncture and thereby draw on historical institutionalism, defining Brexit thus as a situation of uncertainty in which decisions of important actors are causally decisive for the selection of one path on institutional development over other possible paths. And one of the central issues and issues that historical institutionalism is most interested in is the concept of contingency and thus the context of each situation or decision or event. So looking into the context of the of the United Kingdom, it has always had a rather turbulent relationship with the EU. It has traditionally been very EU critical, especially in public, or the publics have been very critical towards the EU. And it's also expressed in the many opt-outs that the United Kingdom has taken from key EU policies such as Schengen or the Euro. And in that sense, Brexit has been framed as taking back control. One of the main points of contention has been immigration and intra-EU mobility, also one of the main motivators of a pro-Brexit vote. On the other hand, the United Kingdom has a crucial interest in maintaining access to the single market, which is, of course, a bit at odds with the ultimate goal of strengthening UK sovereignty, because if you're a part of the single market, you will also have to respect the rules of the single market, right? So if you're not part of the EU anymore, you cannot influence these rules, but would have to respect them anyway. And in that sense, it's not super surprising that the UK has been found to be increasingly ready to make concessions over the course of Brexit negotiations. And then briefly looking into EU priorities. So one of the key priorities is and was to guarantee that the existing rights for EU citizens in the UK will be respected, that the UK's financial assets and obligations towards the EU will be settled, and that a hard Irish border will be avoided by all means. Brexit has been mostly discussed as a legitimacy crisis for the EU, and therefore the literature has found or has discussed that the EU is emphasizing a holistic and orderly approach without wanting to politicize single political areas or issues, and avoiding a cherry picking from UK side. And that's important to remain united as a European Union, but also to strengthen the bargaining position. And finally, context of Ireland. In terms of relationships with the UK and the EU, it has always had very close bonds with the United Kingdom. Also expressed in, for example, a common travel area on the Irish island, leaving the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland a rather weak border in that sense. And the relationship with the EU is characterized by economic and political dependencies that have grown during the economic crisis due to bailout funding that Ireland has received. But the EU has also been a facilitator of peace in terms of the Good Friday Agreement. So in that sense, Ireland is the most affected third party. The Irish border has been the most salient issue in Brexit negotiations, and Ireland has threatened to veto any deal that would result in a hard border.
Okay, about methodology, how do we plan to approach our analysis? We have 814 public speeches that come from the period between 1st of January 2016 to 31st of January 2020. These speeches are a result of subsetting using a Brexit dictionary based on the so-called Brexit glossary. So we have something like 414 speeches coming from the UK, and exactly a half of it coming from EU and the Ireland. Our speeches come from political executives. About the content of these speeches, to give you a bit of an insight. So the most frequent used words in our speeches are European, there's emphasis on people, a lot has been said about trade, so you see the frequencies here. So a lot has been discussed about the future, the role of the governments and the individual countries. And we're gonna discuss in details what do these words actually mean with regards to specific Brexit topics. So we plan to test the general expectations that were presented earlier using a comparison between keyword-assisted topic models and structural topic models, which allow us to combine both deductive and inductive approaches to non-supervised machine learning. What is the exact difference? Any topic model uses, cuts the speeches into different topics, where the topics are built based on the co-occurrence of words. STM's models are special because they also take into account covariates, such as, in our case, where do speeches come from? KeyATM is similar, that it also takes into account, it can also take into account covariates, but as opposed to STM, which is entirely inductive, where there's clustering of co-occurring words, KeyATM allows us to also use predefined topics that are expected from the side of the researcher to be salient from the context of the literature and the discussion. So we use these two approaches to analyze our data. First, something about the KeyATM and about the deductive part. We expect, based on the literature and based on the public discourse, that a lot would be emphasized, that a lot of speeches would emphasize immigration, Irish border, and the Brexit agreement. So these are three important topics for us. In addition, we also expect that foreign trade, finance, labor, and international affairs, particularly for UK as a lever, would be important topics to be discussed in the context of Brexit. we use key words from the Lexicoder policy agendas and from Brexit glossary. From the perspective of topic distributions, perhaps somewhat surprising, we see that the two economic topics, foreign trade and finance, seem to be the most represented. So they have the highest keyword, topic word distribution, followed by the topics of immigration, foreign affairs, borders, and then following the other topics. This is perhaps somewhat surprising, considering that public discourse has really focused on the aspect of immigration, the topics of agreement, and the topics of Irish border. And now we move on the part of inductive aspect of the KeyATM model. So as I mentioned earlier, we allow in our model to define 3 topics not based on the keywords, but based on the co-occurrence of words in the corpus. So the topics that we get here are the topic of protection, the EU, and research. So these are the topics that we've manually coded. The topic of protection is interesting as it focuses not just on the security aspect and on defense, but rather on protection of the values, of laws, rights, and on the aspect of doing that together as friends, perhaps. We also see quite a strong European topic, and an interesting, for us as researchers, topic that focuses on research, innovation, education, and probably how Brexit is affecting all of that. Let's take a look into how different actors, to which extent do they focus on each of these topics. So here it's important to note that somewhat as we expected, most of the topics are discussed primarily by UK, such as, for example, we see here foreign affairs, and we see Brexit agreement here. Also, the importance of the topic in this in topic 7 of Brexit agreement. We also see this emphasis that UK puts on international affairs. Some topics, such as the topic of Irish border, are emphasized and are very salient for Ireland, while the topic 9, EU, shows us basically that EU emphasized in its speeches mostly actually EU. So as we expected, it somewhat refuses to discuss individual subtopics, and it mostly focuses on general EU-related topics. And what about the differences in which these 3 actors frame the topics? So now we know which topics did they emphasize while talking about Brexit, and now we're going to find out how do they discuss these topics. Let's first take a look at a very interesting topic of migration. So we see that all 3 of them share emphasis on work, support, government, inclusion. However, UK, for example, emphasizes life, going forward, continuing, while Ireland emphasizes aspects such as development, society. It is really interesting that EU is the only out of these 3 actors that specifically emphasizes refugees, perhaps permanent deals on how to handle immigration. Another interesting topic, and the framing of this topic, is borders. So we see a lot of common words such as agreement, good, Ireland, referring to the Good Friday Agreement, emphasis on the Northern Ireland and its border. We see, for example, that the UK emphasizes control, while Ireland emphasizes aspects such as peace, referring to its not so peaceful past, which was solved with the Good Friday Agreement. On the third hand, EU emphasizes citizens, perhaps focusing on protection of its citizens once the Brexit finalizes. Let's now move quickly to our STM model, for which, as we said earlier, this is a completely inductive model with manually coded topics. This is what we get. So we specify a model with 10 topics, and we don't cannot provide keywords for any of these topics. So we get topics that are based on the co-occurrence of the words in the documents. The first and the most prominent topic is the topic of European Union, followed by a topic on the Irish border, foreign trade, security, financial markets, research, which are all topics that we've actually seen also in ATM model that correspond to an extent to our expectations with regards to what are the topics to be discussed considering Brexit. Interestingly, we also see a topic on media coverage that is quite undistinguished, so very few mentioned, but we don't see that in the KeyATM, so that's why I thought it's good to mention it. How do these different actors emphasize these topics? So the same way how we did it for KeyATM, we plot these 10 topics that the model has produced for us. I think the biggest take from here is how much the EU emphasizes EU. So this is the first plot that we see, and how it is much less emphasized by the UK and Ireland. While the UK emphasizes aspects such as financial markets, foreign trade, research, security. Finally, as we expected, Ireland strongly emphasizes aspects such as Ireland itself and Irish border. Somewhat surprisingly, perhaps also Ireland also emphasizes health, perhaps taking into account how Brexit is going to affect health services in Ireland. But the biggest take perhaps here is this difference between the EU emphasizing EU and the UK emphasizing basically its economic interest and the relationship it has to forge once it stops being a member of the EU. So to summarize, from the perspective of substantive points, we see that economic topics are very relevant in the Brexit discourse, topics such as finance and foreign trade. We also see that immigration, perhaps not as we would have expected from the emphasis in the press, is not discussed based on the restrictions of entry and on regaining of sovereignty, but rather through the lens of work and support. We also see that the EU, aligned with our expectations, avoids discussing individual topics, and Ireland emphasizes the topic of border, which is crucial for the Irish interest in the Brexit negotiations. And finally, we see that the UK emphasizes trade and international contacts that it will have to forge once it's not longer a member of the EU. From the perspective of methodology, we have compared two non-supervised machine learning modeling techniques, STM and KeyATM, and we find there are complementary approaches. So KeyATM helps us to test our expectations. So we had specific expectations that we could then test using KeyATM. But STM can help us in double checking if we missed topics or layers of meaning. And finally, KeyATM allows us also to explore smaller topics without over granulating that would happen if we would try to do this using STM. Thank you a lot for your attention. Do reach out and contact us on the provided contacts. Thank you.